Today we're going to be doing the finishing parts of our poppy landscape video. I have my colors laid out that I intend to be using today. So I've got on my palette here, it's an old palette, so these are just some dry spots. I have my white, my yellow, my cadmium or primary red, ultramarine blue, burnt umber, and a little bit of yellow ochre. And this right here I have is a little bit of a slow drying medium. So that's what this is here. It just helps for blending and making sure that the paint doesn't dry too quickly. This is not necessary, but it is kind of nice to have. And because you can only use so much water before it starts to degrade the chemical properties of the paint. And then it won't stick anymore. So the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to mix some of my orange. So that gets me a good palette to start with, kind of a variety of colors already mixed and ready to go. So because I'm doing a smaller, more detailed kind of area, I'm going to definitely use my smaller brushes. They don't have to be tiny, but I do want a little bit smaller. Okay, so one of the things that I had been doing last time was building up the poppies in the background here. So I'm gonna do a little bit more of that as well. And just to make sure that the colors are bright. Now that it's dry, you can see things a little bit better. So actually some of these are pretty bright. I like them well enough. So I'm gonna leave all of these background ones alone, and I'm just gonna work on this hill because it's closer, and this hill, and then lots of work on these ones up close. And that'll make it more like come into focus. But these ones I think are just a little bit too thin. So I'm just going to do a second layer on top of them. So what I mean by thin is they were like transparent. I could see more of the green underneath the paint than I wanted. I wanted to have a little bit brighter. So again, with these far away ones, I want to make sure that I keep pretty small bits. And I'm gonna be careful not to have too much paint on my brush. Sometimes I don't really even need to dip it again into the paint. I just need to kind of take the paint off of it. I'm kind of just turning it around and then scooping the paint so that the paint is always just on the very tip. And that will help if you don't have a tiny brush, or that even with a tiny brush, sometimes you have to do that, just to make sure that those that paint is small enough bit on there. So I am also kind of playing with making sure that I have, I'm gonna use just some yellow in there. Mix it a little bit with my orange. Small color, making sure it's kind of bright. Some of this orange looks a little darker than I really want it to be. I want to go with a little bit brighter orange. Except that I do like the fact that the poppies that are farther away are a little bit darker orange. And then these front ones, I'm going to add a lot more light areas on. So that'll work fine. Sometimes it's really nice to just sit and do a whole painting in one sitting, especially if it's a small one or kind of a study. That works just fine. But then there's other times where really you need to come back to it and get. So I'm paying more attention to the shape, as these ones are the closest poppies to, they're getting closer and closer to the viewpoint. So I want them to be not so much of a dab, but a little bit more shaped. So kind of like a inverted cone, triangle sort of shape. and more variety as well, because some of them should have a little bit more of a closed sort of budding poppy feel to them too. So I want to be able to have some of that variety. Yeah. So that built up the color a little bit more than it had been, and now I can start to do some of the more fun things of these poppies that are a little bit closer up. I'm actually going to clean off my brush now because it's starting to get a little bit built up on there. So I'm going to look at this one now because it's a little bit further back, but it's separate from this one. So I could do either of these. It really, you know, there's kind of a variety of what you feel like doing next. It really is up to you. And you don't have to have the exact same poppy setup. You can arrange them a little bit differently. A few of the things that I'm looking at is that I want to have one very large poppy to be kind of a focus, and I want it to be off center. If you want the painting to feel very like solid and really super balanced, if you put one like straight up in the center, can work very well for that. But it also has a tendency to kind of flatten the image and make it a little bit just like cut in half, right? If you have something just in the center. So I want to make it a little bit more dynamic by having it off to the side and having it at an angle, so I have a little bit of wind happening. Also, I kind of have this feeling of I want to have these, the hills and these curves and things that are kind of coming in these different directions, and have this poppy so it kind of pulls the view up around your eye, so it has more, it travels around in the painting instead of just like stuck on one thing and then being done, so that there's more movement within it. So kind of getting the feeling of just exploring the field and feeling the wind and seeing the clouds rolling around and stuff. So I want to have more of that kind of feeling than just like a solid poppy right there, because the poppy is so delicate and moving too. So I'm going to start with this one right here, and I need it to be lighter than it was originally. So as they come forward, I'm going to have a lot more depth and variety of color and more detail that I want to have. Also, this poppy is behind this one here, so it needs to be done first because we work background to foreground to make sure that the overlap makes sense. So I'm going to paint the whole thing over again with slightly lighter orange. And then once I have that done, get all the way up into that corner. So once I have that done, I'm actually going to come in and add a little bit more variation and shading and things like that. So I'm going to make the bottom part of this poppy a little darker. I don't want it to be entirely with one kind of color. I want it to be a little bit more dynamic than that. So I'm going to add in a little bit of burnt umber and a little bit of blue, my ultramarine blue. I want to blend this very carefully down here, make it really just be a soft shadow. And I'm going to use a little bit of that same, decide what I want to do here. See what I like. A bit of that. Create just a little bit of shadow in a couple of areas. Cleaned off my brush on my paper towel, and then I can use it just as a blender, but now it doesn't have a lot of paint on it, so it can just gently feather the edges to make that blend. I'm going to go in with just the yellow now, actually, because as it is painted on there, it's going to mix a little bit, and it's not, I don't want to leave it bright yellow. I do want it to blend in, but I'm going to be able to do that as it just layers in and blends with the paint that is still wet. And if it still seems a little too yellow for my highlights here, I can just add a little orange into it. But I think that once I get this blended in, it'll work okay. And I might take a little bit of that orange. And a little bit more here. So I'm kind of building that one up. It has more dimension to it now. There's more happening in it. And it depends on how finished you want to make your painting. For the purposes of this video and everything, I really don't have time to make a complete finished painting. That might take a lot more hours than I need to show on a lesson video and that I have time for, since I do have to keep a bit of a schedule. So this is maybe more of a study or just a simple art therapy, have a little fun, which is fine. Like, I don't have to, you don't have to have a painting every time that's like, can go in a gallery or win a competition or anything like that. It's really not necessary. That's not the point of painting right now. So what I want my students to be doing is learning the skills and working on those. And so just practicing and enjoying the process of art. I'm going to make a little bit of a pink here, because on the sort of collar bit underneath a poppy, there's always just this little bit of a pinkish tone. I don't want it to be too pink though. I might have made it too purple. So that blue is really strong. It really took over a lot. But I want to have a little bit of a pinkish, purplish tone to it. So that might work. I'll see what it looks like once it's on the painting. So at this little point around here, there's a little bit of that tonality here. And because the paint is still wet, then as I paint it down, my brush turns green really quickly. It picks up the green paint. So I kind of have to clean it off in between. So I could wait until that's all the way dry to add that. I just wanted to get a little bit of a hint of it in there. I'm gonna make a little bit of a purplish tone here. I think that it just needs a little bit of more of that under here. So I'm making that purple with the red and the ultramarine blue, and that's just pushing that shadow back there a little bit. And I can use that shadow on the poppy itself, the petals, and on the stem here, just a little bit of that to give it some shape. A little bit of direction. So that gives me a little bit more of a feeling of what's happening there with that poppy, keeping it pushed behind. I can do something similar on this poppy over here now. Keeping that shape of the poppy is important. Creating a little bit of shadow. Keeping your shadows consistent. So I have more of my light coming from this side. So I need to make sure that my poppies have that same kind of feel as well. So a little bit more shadowed over here. I'm going to use just a touch of that purple. cleaning my brush. A little bit of a highlight over here, a little bit brighter yellow. And I think that actually it might be a little too subtle on this one. I think I'm going to go back in with a little bit more yellow. Okay. So here I'm starting with the light color stem, and I'm going to add in a little bit of a shadow to it too. But I do want it to stand out, so my shadow is going to be the same kind of green as the back, so I don't want to do too much of that actually. It's just going to be to soften the edge a little bit if I need to. But I do want to keep it standing out from the background. So I'm going to add some leaves and other things around to it too. A lot of the poppy though, we just see sort of the stem coming up out of the leaf shape. So I'm going to add some really subtle leaves. The way that the leaf is, it's actually really similar to like a carrot starting. Little seedlings of poppies and seedlings of carrots look really, really similar. So kind of a little bit of a squiggly, oh, I need a lot lighter color for that. So it's kind of squiggly, and I'm just going to hint at the leaves in here. For the purposes of this painting, that's all I really want. Now, if you want to do a much more detailed close-up of a poppy, then definitely feel free to do that. If you want to spend a great deal more time on this painting than I'm going to do, then that is wonderful, and I'm always all for that. So I'm going to keep mine a little bit more loose and simple. Now sometimes too, actually, this poppy color, if you mix a little bit of your green with white, it's going to make it a little bit more minty in color. I'm mixing with my brush, which I always say not to do. It does kind of gum up the brush a bit too much. But it will make it a little bit of a minty color. So if you want to have a little bit more variety and not just have the yellowish tone to it, that can actually work with the poppy that is a green that works very nicely with it. To just add a little bit of that white into it is very accurate for the poppy. So that can add a nice extra little highlight to it too also. So just having a little bit of that hint kind of brings it more into focus. So I'm not going to do that with any of these poppies in the background. If you want to build up more and more layers of realism, then you can certainly do that. And just make sure that whatever the ones are the closest to you have even more depth and detail than whatever you put back here. So if you do some more petals or individual petals and leaves and things in the background, make sure you have more details on the ones that you do in the foreground. So I'm going to add just that. Okay. So I'm going to add a little bit now to some of these ones down here. I'm kind of saving this one for dessert. That one's going to be really fun, and I'm going to have the most detail on that one. But I'm getting there. So I'm kind of building up some of these other ones. This one is going to be the furthest in the background of these three, and so I'm going to do it first. So I want to have my lighter orange to put on here. So when I was painting these two, I wasn't super careful. You can tell the edges aren't perfect. And then I had added a little bit more of that background color in, which is all fine. So at this point now, because it is in the foreground, I want to do it after I've finished with the grasses in the back. So some of these too, you may decide need a third coat. I'm not sure if I'm going to be happy with this one. The opacity of this one, I might want a little bit more layer to it, but we'll see. So with this one, I'm going to mostly have my little bit of highlight of that yellow up at the top and not really going down this edge because this poppy is kind of in front of it. So if light's coming from here, this poppy will block the light, except that the light is coming down. So the top edge of it should get some light still. So I want to think about kind of that shape and the lighting and where other light is coming from and what might be blocking it, creating shadows. Even if I just kind of hint at them, this isn't like a super detailed, ultra realistic painting. I do want to keep it a little bit more loose and impressionistic, but I still want to pay attention to those kinds of things. It will give it a lot more depth and interest. Sometimes you have to go back and forth a little bit to get the blend and the feathering just right. So I'm going to add a little bit of this purple, which is nearly dry. So I'm going to take that slow dry stuff and put it on top of it and kind of wake it up a little bit. So I just want a little bit to hint at here, but I think I might have to make a little bit more. So just a little bit more of that purple. So when it first goes on, it is pretty strong and it might be a little too much. So I'm cleaning off my brush, drying it on my paper towel, and then I can just use the clean brush as a blending tool here. So and what's happening is it's kind of like the palette knife on the palette paper, right? Because the paint is still wet underneath it. And so I'm mixing it in with the oranges that I've already put down. So then I can kind of clean off my brush and hit the edge again. So that is going to make it a little bit different. You have to think about the paint that is already down and that you're mixing with as well. Cleaning my brush again. And let's see here. So now we want to have a little bit of this. I love the poppies have these little like collars around them. I think that it's so interesting. And then this wider part before it narrows out. And then out of this, actually, the petals all fall off and the seed pod grows and grows and grows and grows out from the center. And then if you've ever collected the seed pods, if they're in your yard or anything, that seed pod gets about maybe, 2 to 3 inches long. And when if you just give it a very gentle pull, when it's ready to come off, it just comes right off. It'll be a little bit dried off. And it pops out. And if you put it in a jar, you can actually watch it. And then when it dries, the seed pod pops open, and the poppy seeds just explode out and go all over. So it's kind of fun to watch them in the jar if you can happen to see it when it happens, and they just explode. And all of a sudden, poof, all these seeds are going everywhere. So they definitely pop, which is really fun to see. Or sometimes if you're out sitting long enough quietly in the field, you can actually hear and see them explode and see those seeds go all over. So I think that's really fun. So again, I'm just hinting at the leaf shape here, just some squiggles. I want to have a little overlap with this poppy. I'm not worrying about connecting it to anything. Oftentimes too, the leaves are so much lower than the poppy itself. The poppy is really coming quite a bit further out. So I just want to have a little bit of hints of that. And I think I'm going to do some more of that behind these poppies. I want some leaves coming from behind. And off. Don't worry about going off the edge. That's a fine thing to do. A bit of interesting cropping of the image works nicely. So a little bit of my white and green mixture here just to add some highlights. You don't have to have every color all the way through. Think about the kind of color that you're using and what it is, kind of what is it doing. It's creating a little bit of a highlight with some of these, so I only want to put it in certain areas. I don't want to have the whole thing covered up with it. Okay, so I'm going to do this poppy next. Some of my paint is starting to get a little bit dry, so I'm going to put a few dabs of that slow drying medium on it. And mix it in. So that's another, an important reason why you don't want to have your paint too far spread out on your palette when you're making your mixtures, because it dries much faster than if you can keep it kind of in a smaller contained lump. This puppy is a little bit larger and closer, so I'm going to have a little bit more attention to the detail and shape of it. A bit more of my light and shadow. So poppies are made up of 4 petals, and it may be that the angle which the poppy is turned to you that you're painting, you'll only see the 1 petal, so it would be like a smooth kind of surface, or likely that you'll just see a 2 petal, right? The one. So I'm creating an edge of a petal on this one here, and then this petal here wraps around. And then the rest of the petals, of course, are just in the back where they would overlap. So I'm only going to see a little bit of them from the angle that this particular poppy is being painted. So this one, a little bit more. The more they open up, the more that you see each of those individual petals. If they're more closed, you're really only going to see the one wrapping around because it's so small. This one needed just a little bit more happening in it, but I didn't want it to be too bright compared to this one. So I just kind of toned it down a little bit, adding a little bit more orange back into it, but it still needed to have something else happening. So sometimes as you move around the painting and paint a new area, then a previous area doesn't look quite finished, or it looks a little out of place once you get other areas painted. So you have to kind of go back and adjust it just a little bit to make sure that it fits. So for that reason, I think that it's better not to try and make each area totally finished before you move on, but to just assume that you're going to have to go back and rework it a little bit at a time. And then at this point of the painting, you are going to start to have just smaller and smaller changes that you need to make as you do the painting. They're going to be a little bit more finished each time. And so that makes sense, but especially in the beginning parts of it. So I want to give this poppy a little bit more of a kind of that shape flaring out. So I'm going to make that edge go out, and then I'm going to do the same thing with the darker orange on this side. Just give it a little bit more of like a bell kind of shape so that it comes out over here. Just a hint of it. Yep. And I'm ready to do the base layer here. So if your paint is getting dry, if it's too dry, you can use just a little bit of water to help it spread. But remember that if you use too much water, then the paint actually, it gets too thin, and then it's not going to work as well. That layering is not going to work out too nicely. And then it also, when it dries, it will flake and not stick to the canvas anymore. Or even as you're trying to paint it, you'll keep making more strokes of the paint and it'll just keep lifting off. So you really have to be careful about how much water you're using. Very, very different than watercolor, right? So we want to make sure that that's different. Make this color a little bit more pink. That if you get a chance to go out on a walk and see the poppies, they're really nice right now. And really take a moment to observe and notice some of these colors. That there's sort of these little stripes that happen too when you see it really up close. This is a very light sort of color around the base of the poppy flower, and then it's really kind of like a stripe, and that's going to have sorry, painting and talking at the same time is hard. So you want to get a little bit of that purpley pink feel to it on this light color, but then also making sure I'm losing a little bit of my shadow here. So I'm trying to get that back so that it's still connected here. I'm going to put a little bit of a dark shadow in here too. Sometimes that just a little bit of a dark touch can work out really nicely. So as the flowers get bigger and closer up, then we can do more of those and it'll make sense. So this, again, I'm thinking in terms of my shadow. My light is coming from this way, so I need to have my shadows on the right-hand side and then a highlight on the left side. So the stem is a little bit thicker here. Of course, that one's just going off the edge. Add a little bit of a shadow to it. Just going to use just a touch of ultramarine. A little bit of a shadow on that one. There we go. Just a hint. Okay. So I'm going to mix a little bit more of my lighter. I'm not using nearly as much of this darker color as I thought I might, and it'll be really easy to get it back. So I'm going to make a little bit more of a lighter orange over here, because I am running out of that. I'm using a lot more of that. And my yellow's starting to dry too, so if I need to use a pure yellow, I can squeeze out a bit more, but in the meantime, I want to make kind of a lighter orange here to work with. So this one I want to have a little bit more interesting. I want this petal to be wrapping around. So I'll have this one that's kind of opening up more in comparison. So it's going to be separating out from the main part of the poppy and kind of opening up. And then I'm going to have this part. So for this, since that petal is going to be coming from the back and opening up, I'm going to have it be more light along this edge here that I'm painting. That's going to need just yellow mixed in with that orange. So I'm going to get the feeling of this little triangular shape is going to be coming from behind and wrapping around. So it needs to be dark in there, and this edge of the poppy petals needs to be light in comparison to it in particular. So whatever types of oranges that you're using, keep that. And then I also want to get, again, a little bit of that bell shape. So I want to take this corner and kind of push it out just a little bit more, and then do the same thing on this side over here, where this corner is pushed out. Just a little bit more. Oops. So I'm having a little bit of that wrap around here. This is more bright and it's wrapping around. Then I can also brighten up this top edge of it here, because there's sort of light coming, filtering through it a bit. And so I'm going to get a little bit of that feel. So of course, the poppy petals are very, very thin. So sometimes you get some really cool light effects. So I want to give a little bit of that feeling here. Not too much. So there's a little bit of back and forth that has to happen. A little bit of an edge there. And then I think that I can add a little bit more yellow to this corner to make sure that it pops forward. So anywhere you were going to add like a nice bright yellow highlight, or any kind of color in any sort of painting, right? A bright light color is going to be that highlight, which is going to make it come forward. So it seems a lot closer to us on that edge. So I want to make sure that that's what I have happening in here. Because it's a cylinder sort of shape, I might have a little bit over here too. So not entirely always just on one edge, but think about it being a whole cylinder, sort of like a cup, right? And sometimes some of that highlight will go a little bit further in, something like that. Okay, so now I'm going to create a little bit of my shadow colors too. I'm going to probably need to mix, because I'm doing such a small mix of my purple, it seems like I have to remix a little bit of that purple every time I finally get around to it again. Just to create a little bit of shadow along the edge. Just a touch of it in there. So. Again, if you come in with a clean, somewhat dry brush, you can kind of feather the edges and make them a lot more subtle and disappear. Then I'm ready to put the stem and collar on this one. My green is getting really dried up now. Probably going to have to mix some, definitely gonna have to mix some new green by the time I get there. So some of it is not, it's green, this bigger pile of it is not as dry. So I can kind of mix a little bit fresh into that. Coming off the edge. Fine. See if I have a little bit more of this. This is the minty green that we mixed a little bit of white with it. Get some of that. Now, because it is close to the edge, I don't want to have too much, even though it's really close to us, the closer I get to the edge, I don't want to have too much detail because it'll feel funny coming off the edge. So even though maybe there should be a little bit more on this one, I'm just going to leave it. I'm just going to give it a little bit of that purple or blue, a little bit of that ultramarine blue as a little bit of a shadow, and just kind of simplify it a little bit more than I would if it was more centered. Just make sure that that's kind of tucked away, because I don't want to encourage the viewer's eye to be at the edge of the painting and to go away from the painting. I want to keep it more looking in. So I just kind of soften that a little bit. So this gives me a little bit more shape of what's happening here. So now this one actually seems not quite as blended, and so now I feel like that poppy looks a little funny to me now. So I'm actually going to change it and add a little bit more just a little bit more orange to it, and a little bit brighter yellow highlight. I think I like that a little bit better. I might actually want this one to be a little bit more yellow also. Was avoiding more of the yellow, but now as I've blended it in more in some of the other areas, it's making more sense. And so all of these front close-up poppies are having a little bit more of that tone to them. So I want to bring that into those so they feel like they're all part of the same poppy field, same variety. I'm going to switch to my larger brush for a little bit. This is the largest of the poppies that we're doing so far. I'm going to get a little bit more of this yellow to keep it light. So I have more of my light orange in here. So I'm going to use quite a fair bit more. It's amazing how much more paint you use on this area. Like you start to realize how small some of these are. It's like, oh, this is 3 times as much paint as that other spot. So being able to build all that up. So what do I want to do with this one? So there's a little bit, again, a little bit of the bell kind of shape, and I'm going to have more individual petals that I can see on this particular poppy. So right there was a little bit of clump of dried paint, so I just scooped it out and put it on my palette off to the side because I didn't want to have that in there. So the top edge, I don't want to be have as flat now. I want to give it more shape and curve into this one. I'm going to have a lot more of that kind of detail. And I'm going to switch to my other brush again soon, I think. I just want to get down a lot of that paint pretty thick, so that this poppy feels very solid. And then I want to look at what's happening in the tip. And I'm probably going to have to turn my, trying to keep my painting really straight and even for the camera, but I don't think that's going to work for me anymore. So I'm going to have to move it. So let me just make sure that that's, okay, so that should be working okay. All right, so I want to look at some of these curves and things like that. When I have a lot of petals built up, then I'm going to see some other things happening. I have to decide where now I have just a flat poppy kind of shape, and now I need to get more details into it and look at where I'm going to make some of these changes. So I think I'm going to have, it's going to come up a little bit more like this here, and I'm probably going to have to add in some extra layers of the paint as it dries. If I try and do too much here, I'm just going to keep wiping it away, right? I'm trying to show you that. It's like, it's just not going to happen. So I'm going to have to lay some of it down, let that dry, and get another layer on top of it once it's dry. So I can do that, get a little bit of curve happening over here onto this petal area. And let it kind of curve out over here too. So I might have to, in order to get my brush angle just right. So I'm keeping the tip of my brush, right? Because I want to have more control over this shape. I have to keep the tip of my brush outward. And then also try and make sure that my my brush isn't having too much paint sort of globbed up on the edge of it, which also makes it difficult to have sort of that control and with the detail, a little bit more of a detail look that I'm doing. All right, so that gets a little bit more shape happening. And keep building up. So that area, as I try and paint it more, it's starting to lift up the paint. So I just have to wait until it's dry and I can put a second layer on. Okay, I'm gonna clean my brush. So I'm gonna always keep my brush from getting too like built up with a lot of paint. So sometimes you just have to clean, even if I'm still using that same orange, which I am using those yellows and oranges still, I still need to clean it off a bit here and there. All right, so I'm gonna have this be a petal right here. That's gonna be kind of a small petal coming in, and I need to create sort of a shadow inside and then have a highlight on it. So I'm gonna look at some of those shadow type areas that I'm gonna need to make using a little bit darker orange, and that's just going to be right up along this edge over here. Kind of look at, like, so what is this shape that I'm trying to make here? This petal coming out. How do I want that shadow to be? Do I want a little bit of purple into it? Not too much. So I'm using just a little bit of that. Cleaning my brush now, so that's just more of a blender. Just soften that up a little bit. Might be too soft, so it's kind of one of those. There's a lot of back and forth that's going to happen at this point to kind of just slowly build up where you want some of those shadowed and blended areas to be. So then I also can look at, all right, so now I think I'm ready to put a little bit more of a highlight onto this part of it here to make sure that this petal is nice and bright, because that's going to make my shadow area look different compared to however I changed this. Right. So I have to look at how this is coming. So for this one, I had the petal coming from the back and just sort of, so if this was the, this is the flower, right? And then I have this petal coming from behind here. This one I'm having it wrap around a little bit more. So it is coming from the back, but now it's kind of flopped over. So instead of like this, it's like this. So that's why this shadow is looking a little bit different than on here. So I want to have the direction of that, that petal be just a little bit different. So I want to do some things to the edge here. Adding a little bit darker, strong line of a shadow there will help that pull that over and make sure that I have a good highlight right along like this edge of it too. Well, it's not really an edge, it's kind of in the center. So, but if it was a cylinder, right, it's rounded, then this is the part that's closest to us. That could be having more light on it as opposed to this part starting to wrap around and away. So this will have a little bit more of a highlight. Which just helps give it a little bit more shape right there. Cleaning my brush again. Now I can think about the sort of shape that I have here. Even though this is going to be another full petal here, I want it to kind of, it's going to have a sort of looping shape to it. So I want to work on some of that shape as well. So I'm probably going to mix some more of my purple. So that is actually working really nicely to get some of this shadow in. A little bit of white. So because I'm mixing with my brush, I'm actually going to clean my brush too. And then I can work on a little bit more of the shadow, maybe with some of the orange. So underneath here, I don't want the orange in it. Underneath here, kind of edging upward. I might need to make it a little bit stronger by comparison. And if I feel like it's getting too purpley up there, I can just add in a little bit more of that orange and feather it in. It's a very just gentle feather stroke of the brush. Then I can create a shadowed area here. Blending and feathering the edges. Needs a little bit more of the orange in here. Cleaning my brush. I want some more light highlight along this edge of the flower petal here, here. And I'm gonna have this one is the front edge, or the top edge of the front petal. It will have some highlight that goes down as well. And then this is actually the back petal we're seeing a little bit of on this particular one is back here. This sort of bump shape back here, which I needed to have dry so I could kind of layer it up a little bit. So that one's behind, and then this one comes up. So we just see a little bit of that further back one. And then I think if I can get it to do it. So then this would also probably continue. This would have a little bit of a highlight on it as well, but not too much because I want to make sure that that one's further behind, keeping this one more up front. And then a little bit of a highlight here as it goes to this edge. Not as much of a highlight. Highlight the whole top edge. So again, thinking about where the light is coming from, which side should have a little bit more shadow. I might use a little bit more of a red. Create some drama here to create that edge. Might be too much, I don't know. Think about if I like that. I don't think I do. It's just a little too red for this. So and I might decide that actually I think that this came out a little bit too something. It blends in with the background colors a little too much, so I'm actually going to change that. I want that to be a shadowed area. It really does need to be a shadowed area, but the color wasn't quite right, so it wasn't working, wasn't quite doing what I wanted it to do. I'm going to build up the paint a little bit thicker here, cover up the change in my plans. So again, unlike watercolor, it's really easy to change your mind with certain things. So you can just, you know, not worry about too much about how it's coming at any one point, because you're going to be able to adjust that as you go. Or not even as you go, you know, when it's dry, you're going to be able to make a lot of changes and paint directly on top of it if you don't do it as you're painting. So now I want to just do a little bit more that yellow just to blend it out a little bit. I want a little bit more of that highlight back on the top. I want a little bit more of that highlight on that edge over here to really make sure that this part, this petal, comes even more forward. So it is the closest petal to us. So that edge pops it forward a little bit more, and then maybe just a little bit more blending to change the shape of what's happening over here. Make sure it has a little bit of that curve. That might be. And then just a little bit more of the darker orange to this section to create that shadow. Okay, so now I want to see what it looks like with the this is starting to get pretty dry. I don't know if I'm going to it work. This color. So I have a little too much water on my brush, trying to reconstitute this paint, so it's really quite thin. I'm probably gonna have to squeeze out just a little more yellow. Just about all that I have left is a little bit more. So I can mix it with a little bit of my green I've already made. And a little bit of the white. Okay. Now when I paint that on. So it's a little bit too bright at first. I will put some highlights on it, but I'm going to start off with a little bit more of a mid-tone to it here. I'm going to use a little bit of my ultramarine mixed in with the green to create a little more shadow along the edge here, along this edge. Clean off my brush. I want to create a little bit more of that like pink. Finding that just the red with the white to create a pink isn't quite the right pink, so just putting in a little bit of ultramarine really helps it get closer to the kind of color. So just a touch of that. So then I can add a little bit more of that detail as it goes around behind here into what's more of a shadow. I'm going to add a little bit more ultramarine. I'll shade it just a little bit. And if I use my green with just a touch of the ultramarine, a little bit more of the ultramarine to make it a darker color, then I can use that as my shadow here. Kind of build that shadow up. And then I'm also going to want to do some more of the more green again. Cleaning and drying my brush. I'm going to go back to my palette knife actually to mix a little bit more of this green that I want. So I'm trying to scoop it. So I'm nearly done for what I'm going to do with this painting. Working on these last touches. So here we go. So because I made the background area here on this one pretty dark, that's going to make my light green show up a little bit more strongly against it, whereas this one is a little bit more subtle. This is going to have a stronger contrast, which will also help draw the eye here and make it more of a noticeable focal point. So with this one, I'm actually going to include a stem, which I haven't included a stem on any of these leaf shapes yet. So, but with this one that's closer up, I'm going to go ahead and do that. And it'll give it a little bit more structure and detail. So again, look carefully at your reference photo, and if you can, go out and look at some poppies in real life. That is even better. Kind of the best way to do it. And you can kind of get a little bit more of an impression of what the poppies look like. If you don't have a poppy looking at, if you have a carrot growing in your garden right now, then that helps too. So I might decide, let's see here, I don't know what I want to do. Some more green or not. You can kind of decide if you want to make some more petals, or not more petals, more flowers, more greenery around. So again, I want to not forget, I have this little like the minty green highlight on all of these other ones. So I want to make sure that I include that here. So I'm adding in white to what I had before. Actually, I want to have it a little bit more. So think of that as more of a highlight though. It doesn't have to be, you don't really want it to be like dots. You don't want to make it like snow or something, but you do want it to be just little areas where the sun is particularly bright on those. And it just causes them to pop forward, those little edges, gives it a little bit more definition of what's happening. Think about where you are placing them. So I don't want to have them too low in this area because it's like that would be a little bit more shadowed. So I want to make sure I think of in terms of where the light is coming from to have those. And so again, on this one here too, this stem here is bent over. So at the light, maybe if it's coming from this angle, would hit more here rather than all the way up here. This might be blocking a little bit of that light. So I put the shadow or the highlight down just a little bit lower. So just kind of playing around with some of those things. And you could spend definitely several more hours doing more detailed work, kind of layering up, fine-tuning some of these. And if you are at home with all of that time on your hands, then you are welcome to do that, and that would be awesome. But it can also just be kind of a good study, a good practice, and just an enjoyable thing to do for a while to get a painting up to this point. So I can call this finished for now. And for the purposes of this video, that's all I'm going to do. And but you are welcome to keep going, adding more details, keep doing that kind of building it up more and more layers. But make sure if you have really detailed areas in the front that you kind of continue with a little bit of that detail in the back as well, just a bit. And if you have really detailed areas in the back that you definitely have a lot of detail up in the front, the foreground. Or you can always break the rules on purpose. So you might want to make the detailed focus area in the center, in which case these might be out of focus and these would have more focus. That's a little bit difficult to do in a painting compared to like a photograph, but it can certainly be done. So a little bit of bonus, I'm going to play around with some other sorts of things. I didn't use any of my yellow ochre earlier, and hardly any of the burnt umber actually. Didn't really get into that. So I'm going to scoop some of those out. I'm going to mix a little bit of white and that burnt umber and yellow ochre. I'm going to create kind of a taupey sort of color. So there's these like dried sticks that were from earlier in the season, and they're kind of dryish now and have a little bit of this tonality to them. So I kind of just want to add a little bit of visual texture, something a little bit different happening also in the painting. So I really liked in my original sketch, I had a little bit of this. So I think I'm going to include it now. Let me see what it looks like to have a little bit of this. Yeah. So I have to be careful about where I put my hand. Oh, I dropped a little droplet on there because some of this is still wet, so I might just like squash it. So I'm trying to be careful about that. But I kind of like in my reference photo, I've got this sort of branch that's coming up. Oh goodness, there's a lot of water on my brush. So there's too much water on my brush. I can dry it off. All right. So there's this really cool like stick thing, and I just liked how it created a very interesting design element because it goes up above the eye level. So all of this here is really low. Nothing goes past where like the horizon-y area is there. So I think that this would be really interesting. I'm using my flat brush so I can just use the edge here. And I just like how it looked in my photo. It goes up all the way up here and bends over. And there was a little bit more of it too. It kind of branched off at a certain point. I think I want it to branch right here. Right, and so it's pretty thin all the way, but it is going to be a little bit thicker down at the base. I'm gonna use a little bit more of the burnt umber along that edge. I want to be careful that I keep it lighter than the background so it doesn't get lost given what's happening there, but still so as I come up here, I use lighter colors, so my burnt umber is going to look darker as I'm having just a little bit of a spot of burnt umber along that back edge of it. And the way I'm dipping my paintbrushes, I'm really just kind of getting the edge of it. So I want to make sure that I don't have too much paint on it because this is just such a delicate little twig thing. Just want to keep my line very small along here. Along this back edge too. Then I can take a little bit of, if I use just plain white, it's going to be much, much too light. So I need to make sure I just have it light, but with a little bit of that. And then if I use that edge right there, and I don't even have to have a continuous line. I kind of want it to fade out just a little bit, I think, as I get toward the So because the clouds are white, I want to be careful about not using the white up at the top there. I'm cleaning my brush again, drying it off really well. And then I think I'm going to switch to this little round brush. It's kind of got these little bud things on it that I saw in my original piece photograph. So I want to make some of those little nubby shapes on it. I just think are very interesting. So I'm just using the burnt umber for this. I'm mixing it a little bit with where I had the burnt umber and white mixture just to keep it from being too dark. But then as I get lower here, sometimes I might just use the plain burnt umber and just kind of adding some of these little bits to it. Then I want to, so I have the dark area, and then I need to make sure that I have my lighter highlight on each of those nub things as well. So just a little, really small little bit. I don't want to have a pure white though. Just a small little bit on them. That'll just give them a little bit of shape and visual interest. So just a little bit on some of those. So I like that stick. I think that is kind of interesting. It has something that goes up above where the hills are. And then I might just add several other of those into there in different places where I think it creates a little bit of an interesting, more texture, more focus in the foreground. So maybe I want to keep in mind that I don't want to have them all evenly spaced across. So where do I want to place them becomes the major issue now. So you might decide that you want to add some little details like that. Maybe some more over here I think would work well. A couple in different angles so that they're not all the same angle. A little variety over here, and then maybe like a couple over in this area. So just kind of like looking at where are my empty areas, where's something I want to fill. Having this single one over here is a very simple composition, which helps bring it, keeping it the focus in this kind of area here, kind of moving around to look at everything, but most of the detail and action happening here. So you might play around with it. If you want to, what you can even do is if you wait until an area is completely dry, and then you paint on it, making sure, like I said, that this whole area here is completely dry. You can even do a little bit of work on top of it, say. Maybe you have like a piece in here, and then you might decide, oh, I really don't like that at all. That's not going to work. I don't like how I put that. You come in with just put a little bit of water on a paper towel. I can just wipe that off. And as long as I don't scrub too much, I'm not going to take off the painting that's underneath it. So I can just clean off that top additional part that I did and make it go away. And then you can start over and decide where you want to put something. So sometimes that's kind of good if you want to just get a little bit of an idea to test it out. That'll only work if your underpainting is completely dry. So do it like wait a day, 2 days, and then you can do that kind of thing and lift it off. And don't scrub too much. If you do scrub too much, it will start to lift some of that paint off. So I just very quickly do that and then take it off right away with a gentle cloth very quickly. You can kind of change your mind with some things and kind of test it out.